They say blood is thicker than water. They say family always comes first. They say you should forgive your relatives because they're the only family you'll ever have. But sometimes, the people who share your DNA are the ones who destroy you most completely. And sometimes the scapegoat child grows up, becomes powerful, and shows the golden child exactly what consequences feel like. Tonight's tale comes from the darkest corners of Reddit, where family revenge stories reveal the brutal truth about toxic family dynamics. This is the story of Catherine Walsh, the scapegoat daughter who endured 30 years of abuse, and her sister Elizabeth, the golden child who thought she was untouchable. This is about what happens when the forgotten child inherits everything, and the favored child learns that karma doesn't care about your parents' love. This isn't just about sibling rivalry. This is about systematic family abuse, the destruction of the scapegoat, and the most devastating revenge a forgotten daughter could orchestrate against the family that tried to break her. Catherine Walsh was born second, and in the Walsh family, that meant she was born invisible. Her sister Elizabeth arrived first, perfect and beautiful, with blonde hair and blue eyes that matched their mother's. Catherine came 2 years later with dark hair, dark eyes, and a personality that their narcissistic mother Margaret couldn't manipulate. From the moment Catherine could form memories, she knew she was different. Elizabeth could do no wrong. Catherine could do no right. Elizabeth got praise for breathing. Catherine got criticism for existing. When Elizabeth broke a vase, it was an accident. When Catherine accidentally spilled juice, she was clumsy and careless. When Elizabeth got B's in school, she was trying her best. When Catherine got A's, she was showing off or making Elizabeth feel bad. Their father, Robert, was a successful corporate lawyer who traveled constantly and ignored the dysfunction when he was home. He gave Margaret complete control of the household, and Margaret used that control to construct the perfect narcissistic family dynamic. Elizabeth as the golden child who could do no wrong, and Catherine as the scapegoat, who bore all blame and criticism. The abuse escalated as they grew older. Elizabeth got a car for her 16th birthday. Catherine got a lecture about being grateful for what she had. Elizabeth's college was fully paid for at an expensive private university. Catherine was told to figure it out herself and worked 3 jobs while attending community college. When Elizabeth married a wealthy banker at 25 in a $100,000 wedding that their parents paid for, Catherine wasn't even invited to be in the wedding party. She was seated at a back table with distant relatives she'd never met, because Elizabeth said her presence would bring negative energy. When Catherine graduated medical school at 28, having paid her own way through loans and scholarships, her parents didn't attend the ceremony. They were helping Elizabeth plan her baby shower. For 30 years, Catherine endured this treatment. She tried to win her parents' love. She tried to be good enough. She succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, becoming a successful emergency room physician, buying her own home, building a life of independence and achievement. But no matter what Catherine accomplished, Elizabeth remained the golden child, and Catherine remained the scapegoat. Until their father died, and everything changed. Robert Walsh had been sick for 6 months before anyone told Catherine. She found out about his terminal cancer diagnosis from a cousin who assumed she already knew. When she called her mother, Margaret's response was cold. "We didn't want to burden you with family business." Catherine drove 8 hours to see her dying father. When she arrived at the hospital, Elizabeth was there, playing the devoted daughter for the nurses while scrolling through her phone. Margaret was in the cafeteria. Catherine sat with her father, holding his hand, watching him struggle to breathe. When Robert recognized Catherine, he began to cry. Through labored breaths, he managed to speak. "I'm sorry. I should have protected you. I was a coward. I let your mother destroy you. I'm sorry." These were the only words of validation Catherine had ever received from her father. He died 3 hours later, with Catherine holding his hand while Margaret and Elizabeth were arguing about funeral arrangements in the hallway. The funeral was a performance. Margaret played the grieving widow. Elizabeth played the devastated daughter. Catherine sat quietly in the back, invisible as always, watching her family act out roles for an audience, while feeling nothing but relief that her father's suffering had ended. The will reading came 1 week later. Catherine almost didn't attend. What was the point? She knew Elizabeth would inherit everything. She'd made peace with being written out of the family long ago. But something made Catherine show up to the lawyer's office that Tuesday morning. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was one last hope that her father had seen her, had valued her, had loved her despite never showing it. What Catherine discovered in that lawyer's office would change everything. Robert Walsh had maintained 2 wills. The first, which Margaret knew about, left everything to Margaret with the understanding that she would distribute assets fairly between their daughters. This was the will Margaret had watched him sign. The will that gave her complete control. The will that would ensure Elizabeth got everything while Catherine got nothing. But Robert had created a second will. A secret will. A will he'd hidden from Margaret for 15 years. And this will told a very different story. The lawyer, Mr. Henricks, was clearly uncomfortable as he read the second will aloud. Margaret's face went white. Elizabeth looked confused. And Catherine sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as she learned the truth. Robert had left Margaret the house and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. He'd left Elizabeth a trust fund of $200,000 with strict conditions on how it could be spent. Education for her children, medical expenses, nothing frivolous, but everything else. The investment portfolio worth $4.2 million, the vacation property, the vintage car collection, the life insurance policies, the business interests. All of it went to Catherine. With one condition. Margaret and Elizabeth were explicitly forbidden from receiving any of it. If Catherine chose to help them, she could. But the will specifically stated that she was under no obligation to share anything with them. The lawyer read Robert's letter to Catherine aloud. Catherine, my daughter, my brilliant, resilient, beautiful daughter, I have failed you every day of your life. I watched your mother destroy your childhood, and I did nothing. I watched Elizabeth treat you like garbage, and I said nothing. I was weak, cowardly, and I let the woman I loved become a monster to my own child. You owe me nothing. You owe your mother nothing. You owe Elizabeth nothing. This money is my attempt to balance the scales, though nothing can truly make up for 30 years of emotional abuse and neglect. Use it to build the life you deserve. And if they ask you for money, remember, you don't owe them forgiveness, and you don't owe them anything. The silence in that office was deafening. Then Margaret screamed. She called the will a fraud. She demanded it be thrown out. She claimed Robert wasn't in his right mind. She accused Catherine of manipulating her dying father, of forging documents, of stealing what rightfully belonged to Elizabeth. Elizabeth joined in, tears streaming down her face. This isn't fair. You already have a good job. I have children to think about. Mom needs that money. You're being selfish. Catherine sat quietly through their tantrum. Then she stood up, thanked the lawyer, and walked out of the office while her mother and sister screamed after her. That night, Catherine sat in her modest but comfortable home, looking at the paperwork that proved she was now a multimillionaire. She had won. She had inherited everything. She had received validation from beyond the grave. But Catherine wasn't satisfied with just inheriting money. Catherine had spent 30 years as the family scapegoat, and she had learned something important. Documentation is power. And Catherine had been documenting everything for 15 years. You see, Catherine wasn't just an emergency room physician. She was also trained in psychiatric evaluation and had spent years researching narcissistic family dynamics, trying to understand why her family treated her the way they did. In the process, she had meticulously documented every instance of abuse, every cruel comment, every deliberate exclusion. But more importantly, Catherine had discovered something interesting about Elizabeth's perfect life. It was built on fraud, lies, and criminal behavior. Elizabeth's wealthy banker husband, Richard, didn't know that Elizabeth had been having affairs throughout their marriage. He didn't know that their youngest child might not be his. He didn't know that Elizabeth had been stealing from his business accounts to fund a gambling addiction that had cost over $300,000. And Catherine, the scapegoat daughter who survived 30 years of abuse, learned the most important lesson of all. The best revenge isn't hurting the people who hurt you. The best revenge is building a life so beautiful, so successful, so filled with genuine love and happiness that they can see exactly what they lost when they chose to abuse you. Catherine didn't just inherit money. She inherited freedom. She inherited validation. She inherited the power to walk away and never look back. They say you can't choose your family, but sometimes the family you're born into isn't your real family. Sometimes your real family is the one you build yourself, filled with people who see your worth, celebrate your success, and love you unconditionally. Catherine Walsh spent 30 years as the scapegoat. She spent the last 7 years proving that scapegoats don't stay down forever. Sometimes they rise higher than anyone imagined. Sometimes they inherit everything. And sometimes they use that inheritance to ensure the golden child learns exactly what falling feels like. The golden child has fallen. The scapegoat has risen. And the narcissistic mother who created this dynamic sits alone in her house, watching her favorite daughter's life crumble while her forgotten daughter thrives. This is what family revenge stories are really about. Not destruction for its own sake, but justice for decades of abuse. Not violence, but consequences. Not hatred, but boundaries that finally protect the victim from further harm. Margaret and Elizabeth thought Catherine would always be the scapegoat, always be there to absorb their abuse, always be beneath them in the family hierarchy. They were wrong. And now they have the rest of their lives to think about the daughter and sister who escaped, who thrived, and who made absolutely certain that the golden child's pedestal was nothing but a house of cards waiting to collapse. Margaret didn't know that Elizabeth had been stealing from her for years, using power of attorney to drain Margaret's own accounts while Robert was sick. Elizabeth had convinced Margaret that the money was going to medical expenses, but actually it was going to pay off Elizabeth's debts. Most damning of all, Elizabeth and Richard's finances were a house of cards. They looked wealthy, but they were drowning in debt. The mansion was mortgaged to the maximum. The luxury cars were leased. The designer clothes were purchased on credit cards that were nearly maxed out. Elizabeth had been planning to use her inheritance to pay off over $800,000 in debt that Richard didn't know about. Without that inheritance, Elizabeth's perfect life was about to collapse. Catherine had all of this information. She'd been gathering it for years, watching her sister build a life on lies while she was cast as the family failure. Now Catherine had a choice. She could simply enjoy her inheritance and move on with her life, or she could ensure that Elizabeth faced consequences for 30 years of cruelty. Catherine chose justice. Her revenge would unfold in 3 phases. Phase 1. Let Elizabeth and Margaret's desperation destroy their relationship with each other. Phase 2. Expose Elizabeth's fraud and destroy her marriage. Phase 3. Watch from a distance as the golden child learns what it feels like to fall. Phase 1 required no work from Catherine. Margaret and Elizabeth immediately turned on each other over the lost inheritance. Margaret blamed Elizabeth for not being nice enough to Robert before he died. Elizabeth blamed Margaret for driving Robert to cut them out of the will. Their relationship, always transactional, crumbled within weeks. Margaret, facing the reality that she couldn't maintain her lifestyle on what Robert had left her, began demanding that Catherine do the right thing and share the inheritance. When Catherine refused, Margaret launched a campaign to turn the extended family against her, but Catherine was ready. She released her documentation of 30 years of abuse to the family. Every cruel comment, every deliberate exclusion, every instance of favoritism, all meticulously documented with dates, witnesses, and context. The family's response shocked Margaret. They sided with Catherine. Cousins, aunts, uncles, people who had watched the abuse for decades but said nothing, finally acknowledged the truth. Margaret found herself isolated, facing the consequences of 30 years of narcissistic cruelty. Her friends began distancing themselves when they learned how she'd treated Catherine. Her church community, where she'd played the role of perfect mother, was horrified by the documentation of her abuse. Phase 2 involved Elizabeth's marriage. Catherine compiled all the evidence of Elizabeth's affairs, gambling addiction, theft, and fraud. Then she did something brilliant. She sent it to Richard's attorney, not to Richard himself. You see, Richard was a wealthy banker, and wealthy bankers have prenuptial agreements. Elizabeth had signed one. And that prenuptial agreement had a very specific infidelity clause. If Elizabeth was unfaithful, she would receive nothing in a divorce except custody arrangement for the children. Richard's attorney presented the evidence to Richard in a controlled setting where he could process the information professionally. Richard hired a forensic accountant who discovered that Elizabeth had stolen over $500,000 from him over the course of their marriage. Richard filed for divorce citing fraud and infidelity. He sued for full custody based on Elizabeth's gambling addiction and financial crimes. He pressed criminal charges for theft and fraud. Elizabeth's perfect life collapsed in 3 weeks. But Catherine wasn't finished. Phase 3 was about ensuring Elizabeth faced all the consequences she'd avoided her entire life. Catherine worked with Richard's attorney to provide evidence for his criminal case against Elizabeth. Catherine contacted the credit card companies and banks where Elizabeth had committed fraud, providing documentation and testimony. Most devastatingly, Catherine shared the evidence with Richard's family, who had never liked Elizabeth but tolerated her because she was Richard's wife. They immediately began custody proceedings to ensure Elizabeth's children were protected from her destructive behavior. Within 6 months of Robert's death, Elizabeth had lost everything. Her marriage ended in a divorce that left her with nothing. She was convicted of fraud and theft, receiving 3 years probation, and ordered to pay $500,000 in restitution she couldn't afford. She lost custody of her children except for supervised visits. Her mansion was foreclosed on. Her luxury lifestyle disappeared overnight. Margaret, watching her golden child fall, had a complete breakdown. The woman who had spent 30 years tormenting Catherine, who had elevated Elizabeth above all else, who had constructed an entire family dynamic around narcissistic control, found herself alone, abandoned, and facing the reality that her favorite child was a criminal who had been using her. Margaret attempted one final manipulation. She called Catherine, crying, begging for forgiveness, claiming she'd always loved her and that Elizabeth had poisoned her mind against Catherine. Catherine listened quietly to her mother's performance. Then she said something that Margaret never expected. "Mom, I forgive you." Margaret gasped with relief. "Oh, thank God, Catherine, I knew you'd understand." "I forgive you," Catherine continued, her voice steady, "because forgiveness is what I need for my own healing. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Forgiveness doesn't mean I have to have you in my life. Forgiveness means I'm letting go of the hope that I'll ever have the mother I deserved. You will never meet my future children. You will never be part of my life. I forgive you, but I'm done with you." Catherine hung up the phone and blocked her mother's number. She did the same with Elizabeth's number. She hired a lawyer to ensure that neither of them could contest the will or harass her for money. Then Catherine moved on with her life. Today, 7 years after her father's death, Catherine lives in a beautiful home she purchased with her inheritance. She's a successful physician who runs a free clinic for underserved communities. She's married to another doctor who adores her. And they have 2 young children who will never know what it's like to be the Scapegoat. Catherine established a charitable foundation in her father's name that helps adult children of narcissistic parents heal from family trauma. The foundation provides therapy, legal support, and financial assistance to people escaping toxic families. It's funded entirely by the inheritance her father left her. Money that Margaret and Elizabeth believe should have been theirs. Margaret lives alone in the house Robert left her. She's estranged from most of her family, who saw Catherine's documentation and finally understood the abuse they'd witnessed, but ignored. She tells people that Catherine is ungrateful and stole her inheritance, but no one believes her anymore. Elizabeth lives in a small apartment, working a low-paying job while trying to pay off the $500,000 restitution she owes. She sees her children twice a month under supervision. Her ex-husband remarried a woman the children love. Elizabeth's life is exactly what she deserves. Ordinary, struggling, and filled with consequences she can no longer avoid. Catherine receives letters from both of them occasionally. Margaret's letters oscillate between manipulation and rage. Elizabeth's letters are pathetic pleas for money and help. Catherine doesn't read them anymore. Her assistant files them away unread, just in case they're needed for legal purposes. Every year on the anniversary of her father's death, Catherine visits his grave. She brings flowers and sits quietly, thinking about the man who failed her in life, but tried to make amends in death. She's forgiven him too, not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger was poisoning her own happiness. The gravestone reads, Robert Walsh, father, lawyer, flawed human who tried to make things right. Catherine added that last part when she purchased the headstone. Margaret was furious, but she had no legal say in the matter. Catherine's children will never know their grandmother Margaret or their Aunt Elizabeth. Catherine tells them that sometimes families are broken, and sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is build a new family with people who actually love you. Her children are growing up with hugs, praise, validation, and unconditional love. Everything Catherine never had. The Walsh family legacy is now one of healing, not harm. The money that Margaret thought would maintain her narcissistic control is instead helping hundreds of scapegoat children escape their abusive families and build better lives. Elizabeth, the golden child who could do no wrong, learned that consequences don't care about your parents' favoritism. She learned that fraud is still fraud, even when you're pretty and privileged. She learned that being the favorite doesn't protect you from the law. Margaret, the narcissistic mother who destroyed her own daughter's childhood, learned that you can't manipulate everyone forever. She learned that family secrets eventually get exposed. She learned that dying alone is the natural consequence of driving everyone away.